As President Clinton liked to say, we brought arithmetic to our government. We limited the state's new spending to less than 2% a year. We passed a 2% property tax cap that has brought welcome relief to the citizens of our state. And we have cut income, corporate, and estate taxes. In total, we have reduced the tax burden on New Yorkers $114 billion. Building forward starts with maintaining our fiscal discipline. I will submit a $145 billion budget that spends an additional 1.7%, less than our 2% spending limit. To stimulate economic growth, I propose a tax cut for small businesses, because that is the engine that is driving the economy. 97% of all businesses in New York employ fewer than 100 people. That's 3.4 million employees working in small businesses. I propose a $300 million tax cut that will reduce the rate from 6.5% to 4%, plus a 15% income exemption for partnerships and S corporations. That's a tax reduction for 1 million small companies and another clear signal that New York is open for business. The New York Built to Lead program will begin by ensuring New York remains an international destination at the cutting edge of air travel. Downstate New York, we will build a new airport to replace the outdated LaGuardia Airport. Not rebuilding what was, but building a whole new state-of-the-art airport. It will be the first new airport in the United States in over 20 years, and New York will lead the way again. This year, we will also present a new vision for the current maze of terminals at Kennedy Airport. And we will also continue our development of Republic and Stewart airports. I also propose this year a $6 million addition to the budget to build a custom center to make MacArthur Airport on Long Island a real international hub once and for all.
All right, that was New York State Governor Cuomo on January 14th, delivering the annual State of the State address, which amounted to $145 billion for the state of New York. Coincidentally, only California and New York have state budgets over the $100 billion mark. Looking into that budget, there's $28 billion earmarked over 15 years for homelessness initiatives. We know there's been a lot of back and forth between the mayor and the governor over homelessness, but as you can see outlined here, an additional 44,000 units for continued support of transitional housing for folks. And looking at this number down here, something that Scott Stringer is very excited about, there's $1 billion for violations and fixing up some of the sorry homeless shelters across New York State. They need much needed improvements. Moving on to get deeper into the budget on education, $25 billion to be exact is the governor's number. That's up from last year. There's $800 million earmarked in there for those very successful universal pre-K programs that the mayor is so proud of. There's also $6.9 billion that should keep tuition at CUNY level to about 2020. Moving on, we're looking at $26 billion in MTA investments. That means 1,400 new subway cars coming, as well as 3,100 new buses. But all that that means some pain with that progress when there's a lot of in stations offline right here in Brooklyn and no L train service, which ain't going to be very popular. But hold on, it might get better. Continuing the push for better transportation, we're looking at $5.6 billion going to the LIR, which is very popular over here under Barclays if you're coming in for a show or a Nets game. And there's also $3 billion going to the Metro North. Finally here, we're going to go back to the governor's $145 billion number, which is just under what the spending cap would be for the state allowing the budget to come in this year. It's going to deliver money for homelessness, and also a lot of that money is going to go to Plan NYC as well. Now here's Greg with our guest.
To help us navigate some of the most important sections of Cuomo's plan for 2016, we want to welcome back Nick Powell, the first ever opinion editor for City and State. Great to see you again, Nick. Thank you for being back here on BK Live.
Thanks for having me.
And for the first time, we want to welcome Monica Disare, reporter for ChalkBeat NY. Monica, thank you for being on BK Live, too.
Thanks for having me.
We want to highlight, of course, some of these proposals that Governor Cuomo made in his speech. First, I want to start with this number, $145 billion. I want to know, and maybe some other people want to know, how did they arrive at this number? Why not $146 billion? Why not $144 billion? And can they lend me $80 if they're spending that much on this sort of thing? I don't know. Nick?
Well, keep in mind that this is just a proposal, so there's going to be a lot of negotiation. There's going to be a so-called budget dance on the state level between the governor and the Senate and the Assembly, so it'll probably end up being a little smaller than the $146 billion. But a big part of the boost in the budget this year is the $2.6 billion that's going towards homelessness protection programs and supportive housing programs for homeless people. There's, I think, a $990 million boost in educational aid for the state, so that's a pretty significant number. There's an additional, I think, 300-some million that'll rebate Thruway Authority tolls. Another 150 or so million going towards environmental protection. So there's all this additional money that obviously the governor is going to have to come up with some way to fund. And it looks like so far his plan for doing that is by slashing CUNY and Medicaid funding for New York City, which Mayor de Blasio probably is not happy about.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the education thing, Monica, we know that last year the governor came out pretty strong on some education policies that he sort of reversed himself on. He's throwing a little money at him and saying, oh, about last year, forget that. This is what we think now.
Right, so last year there was a huge focus on education. There was a huge focus on teacher evaluations and on being sort of tougher, having sort of high stakes testing tied to these teacher evaluations. And this year, he supported the recommendations of his Common Core Task Force, which supported a complete moratorium on the use of any state tests in teacher evaluations. Right. Also called for an overhaul of the Common Core learning standards. So yeah, big difference in 1 year.
Pump the brakes on that. And the teachers union is spending, what, like $1 million over the next 10 days to sort of take a victory lap to say, hey, everybody, it worked. We got what we wanted. Isn't there a better use of $1 million than to just say, eh?
You would think.
Like they're teachers.
Yeah.
Spending, the kids don't have crayons.
Listen, the UFT is a very, these dues that the teachers pay go towards something, and clearly that money is being used for victory laps these days.
It ain't the pensions.
Yeah.
So what are some of these proposals that are likely to die once they reach the legislature upstate?
Well, first off, I think the CUNY cuts are a non-starter. I think if you're an assembly member, especially in the 5 boroughs, chances are you have a CUNY campus right in your backyard, and there's no way that you can go home to your constituents and say, listen, we had to cut CUNY funding so that the governor could do X, Y, Z. It's just not going to fly. I mean, most of CUNY is made up of students from the 5 boroughs. Right. A lot of them serve low-income and middle-income immigrant and ethnic communities that otherwise might not be able to afford a 4-year program. I think that's going to be kind of the big conversation when it comes to budget negotiations. The Assembly will likely throw up their hands and say, you can't do this. The governor will come back and say, okay, well, we have to at least figure out how we're going to fund CUNY long term. I think it's reasonable for the city to pick up a share of the funding, especially for 2-year programs. But that's obviously going to be a big discussion in the negotiations.
So before kids get to CUNY, looking at these failing schools, the governor has some plan to sort of convert them to community schools, and he's pumping money into it. What is a community school? Aren't all schools community schools?
Right, so the idea behind a community school is that they provide a lot of wraparound services to students, so that could be healthcare, dental care, eyeglasses, after-school activities. And the idea is that for kids in really low-income neighborhoods, it's those types of services that are going to help them be able to focus in school, be able to pay attention in school. You know, those are the things that can get in the way of them having a good education, not just, you know, learning the basics of how to read or something like that.
So it's like a one-stop shop. You go to school, you can go earlier and get breakfast and tutoring. You can stay after school and get your eyes checked out or whatever, like a point of service.
Right, exactly. And this is sort of already taking place in a lot of different schools in New York City. It's a big
success?
Well, it's pretty early so far.
Yeah, there's no enough data yet to really, I guess, know whether it's been successful, but it's certainly an idea.
Certainly something de Blasio
Yeah.
is really behind.
Yeah.
He's trying to turn all the most struggling schools in New York City into these community schools.
What about the charters? Because they had the sort of back and forth about the limit and the funding. So now the governor wants to continue to fund them, but he's put some of them on the gotta go list, essentially.
Right, so he increased funding for charter schools, but also sort of said that he might look into the discipline and retention policies at some charter schools. So what you're referring to is that one very successful charter school network, Success Academy.
Charter school network, yeah.
One principal was found with a got-to-go list with students' name on it. And that network has said that was a one-time thing, and we took care of it in 3 days. But you know, I guess these issues have reached the level where the governor said it's time for some scrutiny.
Which of these proposals can we talk about that might be passed or modified then passed?
Passed or modified than passed. I mean, I think the supportive housing initiative that the government floated will definitely be in the budget. Whether it'll actually arrive at the, I think, $2.6 billion number or not remains to be seen. I could see maybe a negotiation in which they maybe reduce the number of supportive housing units that they want to build. But just given the throes of the homeless crisis that we're in right now, that just seems like something that especially Democratic members would rally around, and I could see if in some give and take with the Republicans, they allow that to be in the budget in return for a cut somewhere else. But I could definitely, that I think there's very little doubt will be in the final budget.
Go ahead, Brian.
No. How do you do with balancing the concerns with downstate and upstate? That's always sort of a balancing act.
Sure.
Some people feel like he kind of stuck it to the city, especially when it came to CUNY, and there's like $380 million that we're going to have to kick in for other stuff.
Definitely. No, I mean, I think it's very kind of indicative of the prolonged feud, if you will, between the mayor and the governor. Look, the governor has been going around floating infrastructure proposals that will serve New York City commuters, especially the stuff with the MTA, Wi-Fi in the entire network by the end of 2016, repairs to the L line. These things are good things for New York City, but it's like, kind of the old kiss you in the mouth and then stab you in the back, because, at the end of the day,
I hate that.
where I know it's kind of a weird expression, but no, I mean, I do think there's a lot of that going here. It's he's putting out stuff that everybody's going to be in favor for. Whether we can pay for it or not doesn't really matter. The ideas are great. It's easy to rally around, and then he's basically sticking de Blasio with the bill, saying you guys are running surpluses up to $1 billion plus dollars. You have the extra money to kick in if it means sharing more of the Medicaid growth or figuring out CUNY funding. That's just something you're going to have to do if you want to pay for these programs that your constituents, the New York City residents, are in favor for.
But with the subway, will it ever be like that, less people are in favor of that short term? And this may be a rhetorical question, but it's just like, if the L train shuts down, what happens to Williamsburg?
No, yeah, it's going to be a disaster, and they're going to have to figure out some way to alleviate congestion, because obviously they're going to have to run more buses, where Uber and Lyft and the kind of for-hire vehicles factor into that. It kind of remains to be seen. There was obviously that traffic study that got released last week that said that Uber and Lyft have no appreciable effect on traffic in New York City.
Congestion, yeah.
There's a little bit of controversy over that study, but I think the easy answer will be increased bus services. Is it going to satisfy everybody on the L line? Probably not, but look, these are repairs that obviously have to be made, and especially if we're kind of approaching the likelihood that these storms like Sandy will become more of a regular occurrence.
With the money that's coming in, there's about $322 million that we're expecting the governor to kick in for city schools. Do you have any idea how the city plans to sort of use some of that money? Is there any sort of earmarking or obvious holes that they're going to plug up?
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, so the community schools is sort of the big bulk of the education funding that the governor's proposing, but he's also proposing a $2.1 billion increase overall, and that's over 2 years, which I think sounds like a lot, but a lot of education advocacy organizations are not thrilled at all. In fact, the Board of Regents suggested $2.4 billion for just 1 year, and the governor's proposing $2.1 billion for 2 years, and a little bit less than $1 billion for this year. So we're actually, again, it sounds like a lot, but we're spoiling for a fight over education funding this year coming up. So.
And that being said, how strong a case overall do you think Governor Cuomo made for education during his speech?
I think, there was a lot less than last year, like we were saying. I think it was sort of a bumpy year for him last year. Huge opt-out movement, 20% of students didn't take the state tests. A lot of flack from the teachers' unions, fights with de Blasio. So I think he might have said, not going to go as heavy on the education this year.
So who's winning in this thing? It seems, I think that, and it was on your winners and losers list, that our city comptroller, Scott Stringer, came smelling like a rose, came out of this thing because he stuck the city, say, okay, these homeless shelters are horrible, they need repairs. He got a shout out, pat on the back, sort of blessing, like, go be the mayor.
New powers.
So he gave him new powers, but is he the only winner in this sort of back and forth? I was wondering if de Blasio and Cuomo are like your parents fighting in a room and you're like, Mom and Dad, stop, or if they're divorced and you can like get cool stuff from your dad that your mom says no to. Like, how would you characterize their...
Yeah, I think the divorced parents work. In this case, Cuomo's like the cool dad who like showers. Right, for Stringer, but also just for the city. Like I said, he can shower New York City with all these gifts and take credit for it and say to the mayor, okay, exactly. Your mom will figure out how to pay for it. But yeah, I mean, look, there's no real winner because at the end of the day, the feud is destructive. It's not a good thing when the two most visible leaders of our state and our city are fighting like this, especially publicly. And I do think, in the sense that it's moving Cuomo more to the left and floating very kind of progressive policies, getting behind the $15 minimum wage movement, that's a good thing. But a cynic would say, well, is he only doing this to tweak de Blasio, who makes no secret of being this kind of progressive lefty politician? I think I tend to kind of err towards that side of it, but look, Stringer certainly is the beneficiary, not only in the short run in the sense that he has an easy wedge point with de Blasio with the homeless shelters, but it builds him up as a potential foil to de Blasio if and when he decides to run in 2017 or not against and challenge him. I tend to doubt that will happen, but either way, he's a prospect in the near term and the long term. So,
Nick, Monica, thank you very much for being here. We hope you come back again sometime, and thank you for breaking it all down for us.
Thank you.